This video was possible with the help of the Wolf of YouTube. Enjoy!
Deep behind Japanese lines in Burma at the beginning of March 1943, Allied troops hacked their way through dense jungle. Their leader is an extraordinary British officer, Brigadier Orde Wingate. He is one of the pioneers of long-range penetration missions. Their objective is to disrupt enemy communications by cutting the vital railway running north from the ancient city of Mandalay. For the first time in World War II, the Allies are taking on the Japanese in the jungle, terrain where they had hitherto reigned supreme. Wingate and his British, Gurkha and Burmese soldiers called themselves Chindits. By the end of their first mission, they will have proved that the Japanese can be beaten in the jungle, and that Allied troops are capable of achieving victory in the most grueling of conditions. Immediately after their surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, Japanese forces invaded Malaya. The arrogant British belief that Japanese soldiers were inferior was quickly shattered. They proved to be masters of jungle warfare, constantly outflanking British positions and destroying them. Within 7 weeks, the Japanese had driven the British back onto Singapore Island, which surrendered on the 15th of February 1942. Almost simultaneously, other Japanese forces invaded Burma. Once again, nothing could stop the Japanese onrush. In early May 1942, the survivors of the British forces in Burma crossed the river Chindwin and limped back on foot into India. They were totally demoralized, convinced that their enemy was unbeatable in the jungle. The British position was further threatened by political turmoil in India, with nationalists mounting a vociferous and sometimes violent campaign to drive them out. And by a major famine, which devastated Bengal. These crises tied down a large proportion of the forces available to defend India. And several of the best divisions in the Indian Army were still fighting in the Middle East. It was in these grim circumstances that a junior officer approached General Sir Archibald Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief in India, with a revolutionary idea. Lieutenant Colonel Orde Wingate was an unusual officer. Commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1923, he had soon become bored by peacetime soldiering in Britain. In 1927, he was posted to the Sudan Defense Force, where he enjoyed the challenge of leading natural soldiers. During his 6 years in the Middle East, he also led an expedition deep into the Libyan desert, and it was probably this that gave him the idea of long-range, deep penetration operations. After a brief spell in England, Wingate was posted to Palestine, then under British rule, as an intelligence officer. A revolt had broken out among the Arab inhabitants, who resented increasing Jewish immigration. Wingate had had a strict Christian upbringing, and this led him to side with the Jews. To encourage them to protect their settlements against Arab attack, he formed the special night squads. These also took the war to the Arabs, launching reprisal attacks. Wingate's activities came to the attention of General Wavell, who was then commanding the British forces in Palestine. He ensured that Wingate was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his performance. But by the outbreak of war in September 1939, Wingate was back in Britain on the staff of an anti-aircraft brigade. Wavell, meanwhile, became Commander-in-Chief Middle East. With the Italian declaration of war in June 1940, Wavell began to think of ways of causing revolt in Italy's East African colonies. He summoned Wingate to Cairo and gave him command of Gideon Force, a band of 1,500 Abyssinian and Sudanese troops. Wingate was ordered to attack Italian-occupied Abyssinia from the west, while conventional forces invaded from the north and south. The Abyssinian Emperor Haile Selassie accompanied Gideon Force as it thrust towards his capital, Addis Ababa. Gideon Force performed brilliantly, constantly harrying the Italians and taking 16,000 prisoners. But having entered Addis Ababa in triumph, Wingate was recalled to Cairo. There he became deeply depressed, feeling that his force's achievements were being ignored by headquarters. Wingate then went down with malaria, attempted suicide, and was evacuated back to Britain. But Wavell did not forget him, and ensured that he was awarded a bar to his DSO. Wavell was now posted to India, and at the height of the Japanese invasion of Burma, he remembered Wingate's skill in unconventional warfare. Wingate would soon have the opportunity to put his ideas into action. Having summoned Orde Wingate to India in early 1942, General Wavell's initial intention was to use him to liaise with the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies, which were operating in northern Burma against the Japanese invaders. But Chinese Premier Chiang Kai-shek had other ideas. He selected US General Joseph Stilwell for this task. Wingate was then given the job of organizing guerrilla operations, but the Japanese onrush prevented these from being put into effect. Wingate now proposed to Wavell that he create a special force to penetrate deep into Burma to harry Japanese communications. This would be maintained entirely by air resupply. Wavell agreed, and the Chindits were born. Wingate wanted to select his own men to be Chindits, but Wavell told him that he would have to accept what he was given. In the event, he obtained an infantry battalion from the north of England, which had been engaged on internal security duties. He also had a battalion of Gurkha rifles and one of Burma rifles. The official title of the force was 77th Infantry Brigade. Wingate adopted the Chinthi, the mythical beast that guards every Burmese temple, as his force's symbol. But his mispronunciation of the name led to his men being nicknamed the Chindits. The Chindits carried out their training in the jungles of central India. They were organized in columns of 300 men, with 100 mules to carry supplies and ammunition. RAF radio teams accompanied each column so that they could direct air resupply. Wingate's first priority was to get his men used to living and fighting in the jungle. Not an easy task, given the series of defeats which the Japanese had inflicted on them. Wingate envisaged that the Chindits would spend up to 3 months at a time on operations. They would be constantly on the move, so physical fitness was vital. The Chindits became skilled at jungle warfare, developing a sixth sense for the presence of hostile troops. Inevitably, some men could not match up to Wingate's exacting standards and had to be replaced. Wavell and Wingate agreed that the Chindits would operate between the rivers Chindwin and Irrawaddy, and that their operations would be coordinated with a major three-pronged counter-offensive into Burma planned for the end of 1942. In the north, American General Joseph Stilwell and Chinese forces would advance from Lado, building a road to connect with the old Burma Road, which had been the main Allied supply route to China. The British would attack in central Burma and also in the coastal region of the Arakan. In the event, neither Stilwell and his Chinese nor the forces in central Burma were ready for action. And this left just the Arakan offensive, which was launched in December 1942. But after 8 days, it came to a grinding halt in front of strong Japanese positions. The attackers suffered badly from malaria, and their abortive offensive only reinforced the belief that British and Indian troops were inferior to the Japanese in jungle fighting. Even though Wavell's overall plan had failed, he was still keen to try Wingate's concept of long-range penetration. The Chindits would therefore go it alone. Their first operation, codenamed Longcloth, was to remove a possible threat to Fort Hertz, the last British outpost in northern Burma. The Chindits were to cut the Mandalay-Michinar Railway, harass the Japanese around Mandalay, and, if possible, cut the Mandalay-Lashio Railway. On the night of the 13th of February 1943, the Chindits crossed the river Chindwin. Two columns then turned southeast to act as a diversionary force, while the remaining 5 columns, with Wingate and his headquarters, headed east. The southern force had its first brush with the Japanese on the 18th of February. This delayed its advance on the railway. Convinced that the Chindits were being resupplied across the Chindwin, the Japanese initially concentrated their efforts on the river. It took them time to realize that Wingate was being resupplied from the air. By the beginning of March, both Chindit groups were able to begin their railway cutting operations. Encouraged by the success of these, Wingate crossed the Irrawaddy on the 19th of March and headed for the Mandalay-Lashio Railway. But by now, the Japanese were closing in on the Chindits from the east and south. Wingate was also warned that he was getting beyond the range of air resupply. He had no option but to pull back. The Japanese barred his way at the Irrawaddy, so he ordered the Chindits to split up into their individual columns and make their own way back to India. Now began the toughest part of the operation. The endless marching through the jungle was punishing in the extreme. The exhausted men began to come down with malaria, dysentery, and typhus. They were confronted by other problems.
Sometimes the weather closed in and the sky failed us, and for days on end, men would go without any food of any kind. One column was 10 days without food. When that happened, what did we do? We turned to the mules, poor things, and we had started to eat them. I do not recommend mule steak. It is impenetrable.
The ruggedness of the terrain was another problem. The wounded posed an awful dilemma.
Some were grievously wounded, so grievously that they could not be allowed to continue in their agony. And so we put their agony to an end. It was the only thing to do.
During the last 2 weeks of April, the surviving Chindits arrived back in India. Of the 3,000 who set out, nearly a third did not return. The remainder were racked with disease, and 600 of them were so badly affected that they were never able to return to active soldiering. The physical damage that the Chindits inflicted on the Japanese had little influence on the overall situation in Burma, but they had proved that Allied troops could match the Japanese in the jungle. When Wingate got back to India, he found that WWII had ordered another long-range penetration brigade to be raised. But while Wingate was recovering in hospital, WWII was replaced by General Sir Claude Auchinleck, who showed little enthusiasm for the Chindits. Even so, he did allow their exploits to be publicized to compensate for the failure of the Arakan offensive. This gave the Chindits pride in what they had achieved. A copy of Wingate's report on Operation Longcloth was also sent to London. It was seen by the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who was deeply impressed, even suggesting that Wingate should take command of the Burma front. He summoned the Chindit commander back to London. There, Wingate was interviewed by General Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. Brooke was impressed and promised to support plans for enlarging the Chindits. Churchill, who was on the point of departing for Canada for an Allied strategic conference at Quebec, demanded that Wingate and his wife accompany the delegation on board the liner Queen Mary. The Prime Minister wanted to use Wingate's ideas and exploits as propaganda to impress the Americans. It proved very successful. At the Quadrant Conference, Wingate's proposals for an enlarged Chindit operation to precede a major Allied offensive into Burma were agreed. Furthermore, the Americans were so taken with Wingate's ideas that they agreed to provide a dedicated fleet of aircraft, to be called No. 1 Air Commando, to support the Chindits. In addition, they asked for British help in forming a similar long-range penetration force of their own for operations in Burma. This became known as Galahad. Wingate, now promoted to Major General, returned to India in September 1943. Special Force, as the Chindits were now officially called, was assembled in the jungles of central India during October and November. It consisted of the rebuilt 77th Brigade, 111th Brigade, which had been raised on Wavell's orders, 3 brigades from a recently disbanded division, and a West African brigade, a total of 20,000 men. These were joined by the American No. 1 Air Commando. Wingate quickly established an excellent relationship with its youthful-looking commander, Colonel Phil Cochrane. His commander was equipped with P-51 Mustang fighter bombers, B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, and the C-47 Dakota transport. Cochrane also had 100 Waco gliders, which would enable some at least of the Chindits to reach their initial objectives without the arduous march in by foot. Lord Louis Mountbatten was now Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. He was enthusiastic about the Chindits and keen for them to play a major part in the offensive operations planned for early 1944. The plan was for a Chinese army to advance from Yunnan province down the old Burma road, while Stilwell was to push the Lado road to Myitkyina and then link up with them. To distract the Japanese, there would be a British airborne assault on Indore, which would then be occupied by a ground force, as well as a limited ground offensive in the Arakan. Long-range penetration forces would support all these attacks. But the commitment of resources to the Mediterranean, especially to support the landings at Anzio on the Italian coast, prevented promised equipment from being sent to India. In addition, intelligence indicated that the Japanese were preparing their own offensive, one which turned out to be a full-blown invasion of India. As a result, the British operations in central Burma were cancelled. Although the Arakan offensive did go ahead in early January 1944. Simultaneously, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, with Galahad force now under his command, pushed ahead with the Lado road. The Chindits were to disrupt the Japanese forces facing Stilwell in northern Burma and prepare the way for the Chinese advance from Yunnan. Under the codename Operation Thursday, one Chindit brigade would march into Burma from Lado and operate in the Pinbon-Pinlebu area. Two others would be flown into the area north of Indore, while the remaining Chindit brigades would be held in reserve. The first Chindits to move was 16th Special Brigade, which set off on foot from Lado on the 5th of February. Thereafter, events followed with bewildering speed. On the 6th of February 1944, the day after the 1st Chindit Brigade set off from Lado, the Japanese launched a counterattack in the Arakan. Thanks to air resupply, the British were able to hold on, even though totally cut off. After 3 weeks, the Japanese called off their attacks. Meanwhile, 77th and 111th Chindit brigades were preparing to be flown from northern India to a number of pre-selected landing grounds north and east of Indore. These were codenamed Broadway, Piccadilly and Chowringhee. First in would be glider-borne US engineers, with equipment to prepare the airstrips at Broadway and Piccadilly so that the remainder of the Chindits could be landed by C-47. But on the afternoon of the 5th of March, as the gliders prepared to take off for Broadway and Piccadilly, Wingate was shown air photographs from a reconnaissance sortie flown a few hours earlier. Logs had been placed on the landing zone at Piccadilly. Despite fears that the operation might have been compromised, Wingate decided that the landings at Broadway must go ahead. The gliders took off. Each C-47 towed 2 gliders. Brigadier Mike Calvert, commanding 77th Brigade, was one of the advance party.
Sitting in the glider, I felt frightened. After all this working out and hurry and bustle, we were up there silent and going over these mountains, and I wondered whether we were doing the right thing. And I worried and worried and was frightened in the bottom of my stomach. But my men in the glider cheered me up by ribald remarks and funny remarks about how we were not having to walk, but were taking a free ride this time.
With their twin tows, the tug aircraft were at their maximum load, and this caused some problems. A number of gliders were released too early. Others crashed on landing at Broadway. Nevertheless, the engineers were soon at work, and within 24 hours, Broadway was ready to receive the main body of 77th Brigade. Dakotas began landing on the evening of the 6th. To avoid congestion at Broadway, Wingate decided that 111th Brigade would land at Chowringhee. But there were also problems here, when the glider carrying the airfield construction equipment crashed. The strip had to be prepared almost entirely by hand. It proved too short for some of the more heavily laden Dakotas, and part of 111th Brigade had to land at Broadway. Even so, by the 12th of March, the 2 Chindit brigades were fully deployed. While the Chindits were consolidating their positions, the Japanese launched their offensive in central Burma on the night of the 7th of March. Within a few days, General Bill Slim's 14th Army was battling desperately to hold on to its forward supply base at Imphal. The Chindits, secure in their strongholds and now reinforced by artillery, indirectly helped the defense by drawing off Japanese troops. Calvert now took 2 battalions of his brigade to set up a blocking position close to the village of Henu, 20 miles north of Indore. The Chindits had a bitter struggle to drive the Japanese away.
It was a hell of a fight. The Japs took everybody on. It was all hand-to-hand fighting. Boot, butt and bayonet. In the end, they had enough, and they broke and ran.
This victory enabled Calvert to establish another stronghold, White City. While he was doing this, the Chindits' 16th Brigade, which had set off on foot towards Indore at the beginning of Operation Thursday, set up a further base, Aberdeen. On the 22nd of March, the first gliders started to arrive. Over the next week, 2 more Chindit brigades, 14th and 3rd West African, were flown in to reinforce the advance on Indore. This was just in time, for the Japanese had been deploying troops to the Indore area, and by early April, they had some 18,000 men concentrated there. While his forces moved into enemy-held territory, Wingate spent much of his time flying from brigade to brigade so that he could talk in person to his commanders in the field. On the 24th of March, he flew to Broadway, and then by light aircraft to White City and Aberdeen. He then boarded one of Cochrane's bombers to return to Imphal. And after a brief stop, he took off again for his headquarters at Sylhet. His aircraft never got there. Next day, wreckage was spotted in the hills west of Imphal. A patrol confirmed that it was Wingate's plane. There were no survivors. Ord Wingate's death was a tragic loss, but Operation Thursday must go on. Army Commander General Bill Slim knew that the Chindit assaults were an essential part of the advance into northern Burma. And he immediately selected Joe Lente, the commander of 111th Brigade, to succeed Wingate. The Japanese pressure now built up. As 16th Brigade neared Indore, it was fiercely counterattacked and forced back to its base at Aberdeen. Japanese forces then launched a sustained attack on White City.
The battle normally began at dusk with Japanese creeping up to the wire and putting explosives into the wire to try and blow a hole in the gap. They were usually extremely noisy. They came shouting and screaming and blowing bugles.
And the Japanese, when they started to attack, they first of all had this about 30 yards of wire. It's relative First World War wire, booby-trapped, mines and everything, and with about up to about 12 3-inch mortars, mortaring them, and about the same number of Vickers machine guns.
The The Chindits were also able to call in Cochrane's aircraft to break up the Japanese charges. Eventually, the enemy was forced back with heavy casualties. While this drama was being played out, the Japanese kept up their attacks in the Imphal area and against Kohima to its north. 14th Army was unable to move forward to support the Chindits. So at a conference on the 9th of April, Mountbatten decided the whole thrust of Operation Thursday would have to be changed. 16th Brigade, which had been in the jungle the longest and had made its approach march overland, was to be evacuated by air from Aberdeen. The remaining Chindit brigades would leave their strongholds and move north towards Mogong under Stilwell's command. Before being evacuated at the end of April, 16th Brigade made one last gallant attempt to capture Indore. It managed to seize one of the airfields, but could not get any further. Its gaunt survivors were then flown back to India, while Aberdeen and Broadway were abandoned. The Chindits left White City on the 9th of May and moved north. They began to disrupt road and rail communications supporting the Japanese forces opposing Stilwell to the west of Michino. Another stronghold, codenamed Blackpool, was established as a supply base, but this soon proved unsatisfactory. It was well within range of Japanese artillery and too far from road and rail targets. So another base was established at Indogri Lake, which could be used by flying boats to bring in supplies and to evacuate the sick and wounded. But it soon proved desperately unhealthy, and cases of malaria and typhus soared. As the Chindits advanced towards Mogong, they were involved in a series of fierce battles. By this time, Stilwell's men had succeeded in capturing the airfield at Michino. But they were unable to get into the town itself, which the Japanese had reinforced. To break the stalemate, Stilwell decided that the Chindits must do more than merely disrupt communications. He ordered them to capture Mogong itself. It was a daunting task for troops who had been behind enemy lines for almost 3 months, suffering increasingly from disease and exhaustion, and who lacked the necessary heavy weapons to tackle a major defensive position. After 3 shattering months fighting both disease and the Japanese in the jungle, Brigadier Mike Calvert and his 77th Chindit Brigade now deployed to capture the well-fortified Burmese town of Mogong. Calvert was outraged by the demands placed on his men.
Americans were complaining about us, said we were all cowards, and we wouldn't fight. And Mountbatten entered into it and said, we want you to take Mogang at all costs, I repeat, at all costs.
The Chindits fought a desperate 3-week battle, gradually driving the Japanese garrison back. On the 23rd of June, 2 members of the 3rd 6th Gurkha Rifles won Victoria Crosses. Captain Michael Almond led his company forward with complete disregard for his own safety until he was mortally wounded while single-handedly attacking a machine gun position. Rifleman Tal Bahadur Pun did the same, but survived. Calvert and his men finally secured Mogong on the 25th of June. It had been a remarkable achievement.
The role we were expected to carry out at Mogong was really one for which we were not suited or trained. Frontal attack across open ground with no artillery and against Japanese positions that were well dug in was not really what we were intended for. It was a waste of our expertise, really.
Lentane and Calvert warned Stilwell that their men were now at their last gasp, but the American insisted that the Chindits still had more to do.
I said we couldn't go on, and the Mountbatten and Vinegar Joe and other people, I suppose, didn't believe us. They sent in a number of a surgical team to come in and decide what we were at. And they reported back saying that everybody's had malaria a number of times, that large numbers were wounded, and this, that, and the other. And these people should be evacuated as soon as possible. Otherwise, and Mountbatten used the phrase, otherwise history will blame us. We had been literally fought till we were on our knees.
In 111th Brigade, only 118 men out of 2,000 were still reckoned to be fit for combat. But this became 119 when the brigade commander, John Masters, furious that any of his men should be deemed still fit, added his own name to the list. The remaining Chindits struggled on towards Michenar. On the 3rd of August, Stilwell finally secured the town. Two weeks later, the Chindits began to be flown back to India. They had suffered 1,000 killed, 2,800 wounded, and 6,000 sick. Nearly 5,000 Japanese had been killed during the 5 months they had been in the jungles of Burma. By the time the surviving Chindits arrived back in India, the tide of war in Burma had turned. The Japanese had been repulsed at Imphal and Kohima and were in retreat. In December 1944, the final Allied advance began. In January 1945, the British 14th Army began to cross the Irrawaddy. At the same time, the Lado Road was finally linked with the Burma Road. Supplies could now reach China overland for the first time in more than 3 years. Slim's 14th Army liberated Mandalay in March after a bitter battle. Then the final advance south to Rangoon began. British troops entered the Burmese capital at the beginning of May. Thereafter, it was merely a question of mopping up the remaining Japanese forces. As the final Allied push began, the Chindits were disbanded. Their expertise was no longer needed as 14th Army closed in on the last Japanese strongholds. Wingate's belief that he could build a force which would defeat the enemy in the jungle had been vindicated. Today he is buried far from those jungles, in the U.S. National Cemetery at Arlington, Virginia, alongside the crew that flew him on his last fatal flight. After the war, it was suggested that Wingate had gone too far in believing that only long-range penetration operations could win the war in Burma, and that the Chindits had absorbed resources which could have been better used elsewhere. But the effect of the first Chindit operations in distracting the Japanese and disrupting their communications should not be underestimated, and the gallantry of their final actions to capture Mogong was extraordinary. The endurance and fortitude shown by the Chindits was outstanding, and above all, the boost which their operations gave to the Allied cause and the morale of the men fighting in the forgotten army of the Far East was enormous. For these were the Gladiators, who showed that the Japanese could be beaten in the jungle. They took on and conquered not only a tenacious and battle-hardened enemy, but some of the worst conditions in the world.